Hello, my name is David. I head up the Open Source Program Office at BrowserStack, which is a test management tool. And I'll be doing a lot of the moderation, hopefully today.
My name is Hazel Weekly, and I am very bad at keeping track of time.
My name is Courtney Nickerson. I work for a company called CoopShop. We're an open source accelerator company.
Hello, my name is Kat Cosgrove, and I'm a Kubernetes maintainer. I own the release team sub-project, and I'm a SIG-Docs tech lead.
Because this is a panel, I think I'd like to get straight into kind of some of the nitty-gritty and spicy questions. I want to kind of say thank you to kind of the guests here. I'd already created some questions, but they went and they made even better questions. So I'm going to start with what they have. All right. Right. As more corporations get involved with open source and start improving the space, are corporations treating this as whitewashing, trying to get trust built around their brand, or do you feel a lot of corporations are actually doing meaningful change into open source?
So I think one of the challenges with this is that the answer can be quite complicated in that you can have the best of intentions, you can be moving to try and genuinely make the world a better place, do these meaningful changes, and due to a massive legibility gap sometimes between how corporations perceive open source and how they understand it and how they're able to move through the space, these best of intentions can turn into a project that is sometimes outright rejected, or to something that people don't necessarily even understand is valuable, or sometimes people are even questioning how it's working and why it's working, and it can feel like the concerns that corporations might have versus the concerns that people in open source might have. If you're starting from such a different space, it can be hard to meet in the middle and do something that is mutually beneficial. And so it can feel almost like you're trading efforts rather than working together collaboratively.
I think many companies, most companies, are participating in open source to like get something out of it, right? Either they are getting money out of it indirectly, or they're getting like a better reputation. I don't think there's anything actually wrong with that. Like, yeah, sure. They are doing it for their reputation. That's okay. I'm getting like resources or money or something out of it too. And if it makes them, I don't know, look better in a way that is justifiable as part of their business plan, fine. I don't really care if you're using me to clean up your reputation, as long as you're making it easier for me to do my job.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, it's happening, but I don't think that that's a bad thing.
I think like I'm of that opinion. Out of like when we were talking about this earlier, I'm the corporation. Like I work in a major company in their open source office. We don't do it for the trust, but I know when I look at, because I've been in the space for a long time, there are companies out there who will create public source. They'll just put stuff out there, and that public source, there's no community, there's no way of anyone ever contributing to it, and I think that's where the weird whitewashing comes into it. Lovely answers. What challenges do maintainers face when actually working with it? You kind of started going down that road, but like, what are the kind of the good challenges that actually are good for the project, and generally what are the bad challenges that you come across?
Do you want to start off?
No, you've done it. Hazel has done a lot of really fantastic things in open source, and I think you should start. I will add, but you should start.
So one of the challenges in open source particularly is when you're doing something that's impactful to a large community, there is sort of 3 stages of an open source project. You have a thing that you're hacking on, a thing that you're developing, and you sort of get it out there, and it's you, maybe a couple other people, and it may or may not accidentally be useful, or intentionally be useful, but either way, it's not necessarily going to change things overnight. And consequently, people have somewhat low expectations of it. And then there's this massive cliff in the middle where you go from a project to a community. And this community now has huge amount of expectations. They're like, where's the Q&A? Where's the helper section? Do you have the security thing? I want to report a vulnerability. Do you have, oh, my company wants to use this. Do you have a CLA? And you're like, what's a CLA? And they're like, oh, you have so much to learn. And nobody teaches you this. There's no instruction manual for open source. There's no legibility gap. What even is a legibility gap? How do you explain that to people who just said, look, I released something, it was fun. I did this on my weekends. I don't want this to feel like a job. But then they turn into, well, if I'm going to do this, I kind of need to be paid for it, don't I? And how do I get paid for that? And the corporations are like, what do you mean paid for this? I don't even know you exist. And then there's the third level, which if you even get there, is this marvelous other thing of an ecosystem. And that's where the CNCF can be an ecosystem. Kubernetes is an ecosystem. All these things are ecosystems, and they're self-generating venues of innovation that of themselves create projects, create communities. And it's really cool. And how do you get there? What do they need? That's a whole separate question. Now you're starting to deal with like government legalities and what happens when international things become involved and you can't be afraid of the word politics anymore. Like, what does it mean to actually be an ecosystem? We don't even really know that answer. But what are the challenges that people face? There are many in different stages. And the challenges are really more, how do you navigate that space with a very, very finite, limited amount of energy and time and ability to do it with a project that realistically will last any one human's amount of motivation to see it through.
I'm so glad you started. She and I had this amazing conversation yesterday leading into this panel, or today as well, to talk about exactly this. And I think that's very true. There are different levels of complications, and everything in the talk just prior, we were listening to Avi discuss how the concept of open source is that you're giving a gift. But you get to a point that you give so many gifts, when does the gift giving get any type of reception back? And is this a reciprocal place? And so that in itself, just the basis of how people contribute, how they see or perceive their contribution, and what they think they will or won't receive in return is a massive challenge to navigate from the very beginning. And it's something that you almost have to define in a community space. So you've now created this ecosystem, and you need to start telling people you can expect this or not. Sometimes it's better to tell them don't expect anything at all. And if they show up to contribute anyway, fantastic. And if you can give them something to recognize that contribution or energy, great. But also, when you tell people don't expect anything in return, you need to understand that maybe people won't contribute. So just that fundamental concept of how do people perceive their involvement in the open source space and open source projects is already a challenge that nobody really has a fundamental baseline answer to that's going to function for every different ecosystem, community, or open source project.
Yeah, it can get a little bit weird with big projects like Kubernetes, where a whole lot of companies, like paid products, rely on us. And so they want and demand a lot of things out of Kubernetes because they need them for their paid product to make more money. And there is a line you have to walk with that, because you can't just demand that the project do it, because most of us are working for free, right? So you have to give us something that is actually useful to us in exchange for that thing. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll give you people. What if people isn't what we need to solve your problem, to give you your tool? So that is an issue that is currently close to my heart, because we're dealing with an unreasonable ask in my part of the project. And a company that's not being super great about how they're handling that ask. But you really have to be careful with that, with corporate influence in an open source project, because we're not just like a catalog where you can pick and choose features that you just like buy from us. Like, it's an open source project. PRs are welcome. If you want the thing, do the work, right? You can't just demand it.
I think that's actually quite important, and I think it leads into where I think a lot of companies fail, or at least like some of the OSPOs that I've seen, where they'll just go, oh, here's some money. Here is a person. Like you've kind of described that like at different times you need different things. Could you kind of extend that out? Like, how can companies actually meaningfully engage with you? Like, stop being the assets and demanding, but like hey, we want, like, you're helping us, but what is that one thing we can do? Like, how can, if there's people in OSPOs here, how can they interact with you better?
Yeah, some of it is literally just ask what we need. Like, so frequently they just offer us the thing that's easiest for them to give, and that's often not what we actually need. So like, ask what we actually need, but you also have to be okay with no. Like, sometimes it's something we just don't want to do, even if you did give us like every resource we could potentially need or want to do something. Sometimes that's just not where we want to take the project. We just don't want to do that thing, and you got to be chill with that because it's not yours. It's ours collectively, and you're not always going to get yes.
There's also something really interesting that happens, which is when you have this sort of transaction of what do you need, what do you have, what can we get, there's the last mile of delivering the thing in a certain way. So like, for example, particularly with companies that are founded in America or companies that aren't quite companies yet, like projects that are small, one of the easiest ways to ruin someone financially is to give them $5 million. It is extraordinarily difficult to give an individual contributor or a small project any real amount of money. They need it, but you will ruin them financially, especially with the American taxation system and the American legal system, if you give them too much money too quickly. The money works off of inertia, so you have to ramp them up and you have to ramp them down and maybe even prepare them. But I've never ever seen a company be willing to pay someone a large amount of money and also be willing to ramp them up and help them with the legal and financial process of making it able for them to handle that much money. It's quite honestly one of the reasons why the Linux Foundation is so successful, is that they can handle checks with an eye-watering amount of zeros in them and not fall over and collapse under the weight of that change in inertia. And if you did that with an individual contributor, you would completely destroy them financially and bury them in paperwork to the point that the entire project would cease to exist.
I think that's actually really important. Like, at least with my OSPO, when we interact with people, we always try and make sure that there's a meaningful foundation behind them, just to kind of alleviate some of that pressure, because it's hard. Like, I work on the Selenium project. That's supported by the Software Freedom Conservancy. Before, like, I've been working at Mozilla for years. Luckily, the Mozilla Foundation is there to be able to handle a lot of this stuff, and all I need to care about every single time is writing code, because that's the thing that excites me. And trying to then give back, right? Open source is really about the altruism about it. So I think that's actually a really good point. I've never thought of it that way, but I do it instinctively.
it's the closing the gap.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if it's bidirectional but it doesn't feel bidirectional, it's so difficult to actually get it working.
Yeah, definitely. So my next question is, what strategies do we think are going to emerge as the open source landscape changes over the next few years? Obviously, we see a lot of like AI being introduced into everything. I don't necessarily agree with it, but you know, that's because I'm old and kind of don't understand these things. But like, what do we hope as these things change? What do we hope is, what do we see as success for kind of the changing landscape in open source? Anyone can start.
I think we're going through a real weird period right now. We're seeing a lot of, and well, not a lot, but an increasing number of projects switching to like open source, from open source to like not quite open source or like actually closed source licenses. And I don't love that, and I think it's going to backfire. So hopefully we see an end to that trend after somebody implodes, crashes and burns over switching to a non-public license. On the AI thing, Right now, everybody is trying to cram AI into everything. We've received some drive-by PRs in the Kubernetes project from a couple of AI companies that wanted to be able to use us as advertising. We rejected them handily. They were things for like documentation, but like there is space for AI tooling to be useful in an open source project. I would like to see something that reduces my toil by like doing things like applying labels for me, like triaging PRs for me. That's helpful because that's work I don't like doing. So that is a helpful space that will take a problem away from me in open source. I would like that.
Yeah, no, I think usage of AI should be for mundane tasks, the things that your maintainers actually burn out on doing. There's a massive space for AI in doing those things that your maintainers or contributors don't get burnt out and they stay doing things that actually provide the value that they're hoping to provide. That said, I hope we don't see a massive influx of AI being used to maintain these projects. AI just doesn't have the context around what an actual project needs, let alone how it should be maintained or moved forward, because this is something that's supposed to be moved forward by a group of human beings who are participating. The other thing that I unfortunately have seen as well, though, are people who are using AI co-pilots to create code blocks to try to get those put into PRs.
Awful.
I was going to ask if this happens to you.
No, it was yes, but what we actually had was documentation PRs, and they were atrocious. It was supposedly to automate like adherence to your style guide and some grammatical rules, but it wasn't actually adhering to our style guide, and it was also like changing a bunch of generated pages that shouldn't be like manually touched by a PR. So just super frustrating. I think we are going to see a lot of like really shitty AI written or AI translated documentation before things get better.
Yeah, this is something that I think is unfortunate and really going to put an even bigger strain on our maintainers is when they have an influx of those things, because all of a sudden people think it's super simple to just contribute that way. And so I think in general, as an open source community, we need to make sure that as people move into being new contributors, we want more people to contribute, but that they understand they need to be quality contributions that they themselves are actually creating so that they can receive help from other people in the project. My favorite meme right now is a GitHub meme that says our Copilot is awful because it learned from your code.
Oh yeah, my code. I'm a bad programmer. Okay, and it learned from me.
Exactly. I
Bruh.
think this is so timely for open source maintenance and the incorporation of AI in this space. If the Copilot learned from us and it's awful because it did so, this is the human factor of building open source projects. You're learning from other people who probably know a little bit more than you or who are bringing some other aspect to the table as you're learning. So as new contributors come in, I think it is super important that they understand that we have some sort of governance around the usage of AI contributions as well. And so in my thought process, the future should have some changes in governance to make sure that that happens.
One of the things that I think we're going to see a lot of in the next several years is, and it all kind of comes down to the word legibility, which is something that I say a lot of. Legibility is when you can see through things. You can understand the stack of everything beneath you and what you need from above in this sort of collaboration setup. But as we start to ask for and understand the need in the corporate world for legibility, and for this supply chain, for the understanding of what's going on, what I see a lot of is the negative side of that, of looking downward and saying, we need you to be understandable to us, and putting the onus on everyone downstream of you to be understandable and to be legible. And it's like, you need to get your security policies up to date. You need to get the code quality up to date. You need to do all this compliance work for us. You need, and at no point is it, we need this, how can we help you do this? Or we need this, how can we make this beneficial? And at every level of this, it's not just a one-time cost. It's an increased maintenance cost. And so you take people who like to solve problems, and you give them an enormous amount of regulatory toil. an enormous amount of other types of toil, and it's all necessary useful work, but none of it is what you might call fun. And programmers and humans in general love fun, particularly when they're not getting paid to do it. And so if you're not getting paid to do it, it better be fun. And if it's not fun, you better be paid. But that's just one other type of legibility of, again, we're putting the onus on them to be payable rather than figuring out how to pay them. We're putting the onus on them to figure out how the corporations can help solve their problem without actually figuring out what the problem needs to be solved.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think from what you were saying, the first thought that popped into my head was corporations and general contributors are probably looking at the problem in the same way, in that people want to be able to see that they've been made a meaningful impact and saw something get shipped, right? Like that's what all engineers want, is to be able to say, I added value to that and it got shipped. That made my day, right? Like we all see that. Sorry, the questions got mixed up in my head. How can we make that actually successful for both groups? Because like corporations, like especially for Kubernetes, it's got huge amounts of companies wanting to influence it in different ways. How do we make sure that like everyone has an equal voice, from your individual contributor up to kind of your megacorps like Google coming into your project and going, yes, we want this?
Ooh, I don't think that we should have an equal voice. I don't think Google as a corporate entity should have like an equivalent say in the project's governance over the contributors, like the maintainers. That's not, it is an open source project. Mm-hmm. It's not like a consortium of companies that are choosing to allow this product to exist freely in an open space that other people work on. Like we own it ourselves. So I don't think a corporate entity gets a say. The individual maintainers do, and they may work for those companies, and that's how they get to influence the direction of the project, like getting somebody with a seat on the steering committee. That gives indirectly Google some control over the direction of the project. Not just Google, any big company, obviously. But that's not explicitly the company itself having a say in the direction of the project.
And
One thing I've noticed with that is occasionally you can run into scenarios where you have a majority of people working on a project who are represented by one or two companies, and if those companies don't have an effective understanding of the culture of open source, what we can end up with is the assumption that these engineers are on company time, and the assumption that these engineers are on company bidding. And you can end up in an uncomfortable spot where an engineer whose primary job is to work in open source has to choose between food on the table and doing what is right for the project. And that is absolutely not how you create a trustworthy community. And so one of the things that is so difficult for open source to be legible by corporations is because it's not an inherent monetary economy. It is a trust economy. If you trust each other, you work together, and that work generates value in trust, not necessarily finances. But one of the things that actually underpins our society is, yes, we call it money, but also a lot of it is trust. You don't put all your money in a bank because you're like, cute logo. You trust them. And that trust has been built and reified over time and turns into money somewhere. But we need to start learning how to turn that money back into trust and thinking in terms of a trust economy in open source, and in terms of trust economy in teams, in terms of trust economy in projects. And we have actually a decent amount of understanding of that in human psychology, of how do you build trustworthy teams, how do you build trustworthy communities, healthy groups of people that want to work together and that can have really emotionally difficult arguments about something and know at the end of the day that you have each other's back. We do understand how to do that, but I don't know how well we have applied that understanding to figuring out how to build communities in open source that are first and foremost, there to trust each other.
Yeah, you made some very, very solid points. And just prior to this talk, David and I were having a discussion. He said that part of the difference in open source now is the deterioration of the constructs that our society is built on. It was a very, very astute observation that he made, and it really resonated with me, but also understanding that there's a whole subset of people that don't even get to participate in anything that's going on with open source, because the way things are built already isn't made for them to be able to trust that their time is going to be worth anything. And the majority of those people are highly underrepresented in the tech space in general already. So when you already have that misrepresentation of people who can make absolutely phenomenal contributions to things, but they don't trust that anybody's going to allow them to, or they don't have the means in order to get involved, you have now shot yourself in the foot. And all that does is contribute to a lack of trust across the board as we move forward. So then we get stuck with only corporations and people are working with companies to be part of our maintainer groups. And as you can all see, it takes people with very strong personalities like Kat to be able to stand up and say, hey, let's keep this an even playing field. Not every maintainer has that strong personality to be able to do that. And so the bigger a project is, the more important it is to do and be able to understand things, like Hazel was saying, with just basic human psychology and understanding how human life works and understanding how that is reflected in whether it's your community, your open source project, or the people who are participating in it. I think it's fundamental to making any of this work at this point.
I would agree with that so strongly. And you can actually even see that in research, because a lot of the cutting edge research on taking this psychological safety aspect and translating that into how does this work in tech, or how does this work, and it turns out that developer productivity, team safety, all these related aspects of trust actually come down to a couple different components, of which one of the strongest is a feeling of belonging. If you feel like you belong, if you walk into a group and you go, this is my group, these are my people, I belong here, that is the strongest foundation you can have. Everything else is fixable. And particularly for these underrepresented minorities, these underserved populations, who have such incredible insights, such incredible ability and potential to contribute and make this a fantastic world. They walk into the room, and do they feel like no, they don't. I don't feel like I belong in a lot of places when I walk into the room. I might be the only woman in the room. I might be the only deaf person in the room. I might be the only queer person in the room. I just don't necessarily feel like I belong in a lot of spaces where people would love to have my input and love to have what I can contribute and offer. And that sucks for them, but it's kind of their problem, because I can't magically make myself belong in a space where I'm not welcomed in the first place. And I know that I'm not welcome because I don't see anybody else like me in there.
Well, and these are things that money from a corporation to be able to promote your open source project aren't going to fix, right? These go right back to the things that Kat was saying. A lot of times what we need doesn't have to do with money or the easiest resource that you can provide us. It has to do with a whole other movement of ideals and things and behaviors that actually can't be bought. And that is what makes the open source world function, and so throwing money or contributions isn't always going to be what's going to make the biggest impact.
Yeah, and the other side of it is that, and this is the thing that I wish everyone was taught at university or kind of boot camps, whatever, when you start doing open source, is like you need to have these sets of rules, governance, right, that allow you to be able to build and include everyone. I think that's the big thing here, which is why your bigger projects tend to be backed by a foundation so that they can get these eye-watering amounts of money, but then when they also get that, they also have to follow set rules, because now they've done your 3 steps, they've grown up, and they've got ecosystem around it. Ecosystem means that people might come in with the best intentions, but then say the worst things to the different people. And you need to be able to handle that in a meaningful way. I think that's really important. And I think corporations have a big part in actually adding to that, like in a positive light, right? Like being able to go, here's an engineer who's like Hazel, who will kind of blow people away and just go, you have all the knowledge, could you do this, right? Or even just encouraging new people, right? I think that's where, from my side, I try encourage from my OSPO. I try give projects time, whatever time means to them, right? Because not everyone can take the money, eye-watering amounts of money, you're correct, right? Like, and the tax implications are huge for some groups. So I think governance is another one, but I would, like, how can corporations, like I've done it, but I've been in the space before I went into corporations, but how do you feel corporations can actually help with that governance model if they're not backed by a foundation? Like, how could they get the tools to get there?
So I think this is an interesting question because corporations have their governance structure dictated by what is maximally efficient in the market and maximally efficient in the economy. The economy and the governance structures are synergetic. And when you have a completely different economy, the economy of trust or of psychological safety, the governance structure necessarily has to look fairly different. And so I don't know if corporations, in how they naturally find themselves set up, are best suited to teach or assist with open source in figuring out what governance structures work best for them. I think the collaboration there is figuring out what is mutually legible for each one, because a native open source project may have no idea how to make itself work with a corporation because it doesn't make sense. And a corporation may have no idea how to actually effectively help an open source project because their governance structure doesn't make sense. If you have a bunch of, queer, anarchist, vibe, hacker people building the future of cryptography, which is most of them, by the way, how does that make sense to a legal corporation that is all, oh yes, we do this and we sell things by the CPU core and what? Like, how do you actually get that? So I don't know how effective open source can learn from corporations in terms of governance structures that work for them. But I do think if corporations, because they tend to have so much runway, because they tend to have so much ability to create a space of innovation, like the whole R&D concept is a foreign thing in open source, because spare money, what? What? No. Spare resources is not a concept in open source, but companies have it. So I think there's fantastic space for them to create rooms of innovation that can then be filled by people who figure out how to do their own thing.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a corporation's place to tell
I didn't mean it as a tell. I meant it as a help.
As a help?
Like you've got nothing. Let me help you get to the space where you create that safety, like create the rules. Because, like, again, it's that time thing for me, the way I was looking at it, not necessarily telling.
So it's kind of like a currency conversion, almost, isn't it?
I guess, yeah.
Like if you have, I want to help you, and you're like, I don't accept help like that, but the conversion, right? Does that?
Yeah, in my head I can see the currency conversion idea. Mm-hmm. Like it's the time, like Kat was saying, like, ask me what I need, and I will tell you, right? But to be able to do it to grow through, you said, like the 3 steps that a project should go through, kind of from nothing to a huge ecosystem. And along the way, you need to learn the governance, the rules, the kind of meaningful to keep it as, you said, the queer anarchists wanting to be safe in their space, because they deserve to be safe in that space. Like,
exactly. So then, Kat, how do you think companies can be more open-minded to create the space for that?
I think it would be kind of cool to see somebody's OSPO be hosting workshops for maintainers or open source contributors to talk about like the implications of different licensing models, or like what a good project charter looks like. We've certainly had some like charter related drama in Kubernetes, and we're like an unusually well-structured open source project. We do function a lot like a corporation from a like hierarchical perspective, but that's super unusual, that's weird. But no matter how good you are as an engineer, you may not have like a good grasp on the difference between different types of open source licensing models. That's really confusing without like significant experience in this space. And OSPOs have that significant experience in the space and access to legal teams to
Yeah.
explain those things. So don't think I've ever seen like a talk on that topic or a workshop on that topic. And I think that would be really cool to see OSPOs start doing. That is like giving away free content, I guess. But if you're participating in open source as a way to like make your company feel good or look better to a particular community, that is some more free stuff you can give away.
Also, I think that's a super meaningful contribution to open source, because otherwise people are strapped with the weight of having to find that themselves, right? And as you said, you can be a fantastic coder. It does not mean you're going to understand all of the legal jargon that's involved in a licensing model. But also for the enterprise that's giving that, they might start to understand why certain projects succeed and why they don't. And if they start their own open source project or have somebody become a maintainer of one, they can influence, hey, maybe you should consider this licensing model instead of that one because, and now you've grown exponentially the amount of knowledge that people have in order to be able to make sure that their projects function correctly. Because your licensing model is something that you choose very early on. You don't even always know where that project is headed, but then you are tied to it, and we've seen this happen with
So much
HashiCorp,
drama.
all of a sudden changing a licensing model. Oh my gosh, the world has fallen. And these things are, I mean, we're just human. We're doing the best we can. Life changes, things change or die in this space as well as any other. But if you don't have any basic knowledge to even be able to have perception or context around, okay, if I go this route, this is what my future might have, or these are the future problems I might have because I choose this licensing model instead of another, you can kill an entire project. So I think if an OSPO did that, that would be a massive contribution to the space, worth far more than its weight in money.
So one thing that I noticed in there, if I want to pull that a little bit, is sort of this, it feels like hidden in there is the understanding that most open source projects are themselves. They may not necessarily have a lot of visibility or understanding or awareness of how other projects work and run. But most companies consume a multitude of open source projects and work with a multitude of them. And so in theory, one of the currency conversions, so to speak, might be that companies could be spreaders of knowledge of, hey, here's how I've had this really productive, trustworthy building energy with this other ecosystem. Can we try that? Can, not necessarily screw you do this, but figuring out how to pollinate knowledge. Companies can be pollinators of figuring out how to take these models and spreading these ideas around of, oh, hey, this works for us. This is how things are legible for us.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And I actually quite like the idea of OSPOs trying to spread that knowledge. I might kind of heavily borrow
Steal it.
that, if that's okay.
Just credit me. My Venmo is Cat Cosgrove.
Right, so we are down to the last minute. I think we'll stop there. Huge
You can
thank
talk
you.
really fast.
Huge thank you to our panel. It's been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much to all of you. It's been really great. Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.